Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this Oxford Climate Society event on sustainable food. I'm Ellie Holton, I'm a neuroscience PhD student and part of Oxford Climate Society. We're a student society dedicated to running educational events on climate issues throughout the year and working with the university to develop net zero policies and incorporate more climate into the curriculum. So we got inspired to put on this workshop because there seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm out there for eating in a way that lowers our carbon footprint, but also a lot of confusion about what issues really matter and how to make the right choices. So in terms of responding to the climate emergency, how much does it actually matter what we choose to eat and what choices are the most important? So I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Brent Loken, who has years of experience researching and developing strategy around issues of sustainable food. He was lead author on the landmark Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet and Health before starting his current role as a global food lead scientist at the World Wide Fund. So I'll hand it over to Brent first to tell us a bit about why these issues are important, and then we'll have ample time for questions. So as always, if you have any questions, please write them in the YouTube chat box and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brent.
Super, thank you very much for this opportunity and for giving me the chance to talk about something that we all love to talk about, and that's food. I mean, who doesn't love to talk about it, right? Let me just switch over and I'll share my screen. I've got a few slides here. Okay, is that looking okay from your side?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, so for the next 20, 30 minutes or so, let's talk about healthy and sustainable diets. And I would say that, if there's one thing that people are extremely confused about, it is exactly what is a healthy and sustainable diet. We hear so much in the media and in the press about these issues and about the impact on climate change. And hopefully through this talk, we can start to unpack some of these issues and start to really make some sense about what is healthy eating and what is actually sustainable food as well. Now, if you're on this call, you're probably interested in the environment, and we see images like this all the time. We hear about the Arctic melting. We see these iconic images from last summer of this research dog sled team going over this massive glacier, and it's water, and the Arctic is warming up at rates that we have never seen before. It's really in a warming crisis. We see iconic images like this of the world on fire. It's not just Australia, it's Indonesia, Brazil, and other places. We see images like this all about the species that we're losing at rates that we haven't seen for many, many millions of years. These are all things that we know. We know that people are getting larger, they're getting a lot less healthy. And we see all this all the time. We don't need to keep on focusing on what some of the images are. But I think what we're less, maybe what we know less about is what the connection is of these things that we see in the news all the time with food. And what does food have to do with it? How does food impact it? I think when it comes to our health, there's a bit stronger, more direct connection. The food that we put into our mouth impacts our health. If we put bad stuff in, it's probably going to make us sick. However, how about food and the climate crisis, or the biodiversity crisis, or the water crisis, or the inequality crisis? And what is the connection with that? And when you look at it, food is responsible for, it is the world's, the single greatest environmental impact on the entire planet. And I could talk about biodiversity, I could talk about water, I could talk about inequality, I could talk about hunger, I could talk about so many different things, but let's just focus on climate change right now for the next 15, 20 minutes and the impact that food has on climate change. And I think when we think about the climate crisis, we tend to think about, well, it's actually a transportation problem. It's flying, it's driving, or it's industry's problem, or it's buildings, or it's the amount of power that we use, electricity. And yes, those are extremely important areas, but we tend to forget that 24% of the issue, 24% of the climate crisis comes directly from food and agriculture. It's the methane that we produce from the animals. It's the nitrous oxide from fertilizers, from rice. It's how we're using the land. It's the cutting down of the trees and using it for, whether it's soy for cattle or for other things. That's 24% of the climate crisis that we tend to neglect. And it's very often not addressed in international policy. Now, unfortunately, you can see what this is saying is where we will go between now and 2050 if we don't do anything. And this is just looking at the emissions coming from food. And if we don't do anything, and if people continue to eat the way that they are, and if the Western habits of eating, high consumption of red meat and other foods, gets transported to other places, the greenhouse gas emissions will essentially double by 2050. And the wiggle room that we have for meeting the climate crisis, for tackling it, is so small that if we double food emissions by 2050, we will have no chance of achieving Paris. So you can see that there's something that needs to happen. Now, the great thing, and when you look at foods, there are some foods that have a higher impact than others. And you can see here on the y-axis, you have the environmental impact going up from the bottom to the top. You have the increased risk to health, going from low to high, from left to right. And the research is becoming increasingly clear that there's certain foods that have much higher impact than both of these things. So if you're looking at unprocessed red meat, processed red meats, these things have a high impact on the environment and a high impact on our health. Dairy does as well. Chicken, fish, it's a lot of the animal source foods. But then when we switch to some of the plant source foods, the nuts, the legumes, the whole grains, veggies, fruits, these foods have a much lower impact on our health. They're very, very healthy for us, and also on the planet. So you can see that as we start to switch to some of these foods, it's not only good for us, it's good for the entire planet. Now, what does this look like in terms of switching to more of a healthy diet? So I worked on the Eat Lancet report for about 3 years, and we published a study back in January of 2019, where we wanted to unpack exactly what healthy food was. Like I said at the very start of this, there's so much confusion about healthy food. So we wanted to say, well, what does a healthy diet look like? And essentially, if you want to visualize it, this is what it looks like. Half your plate should be a lot of fruits and veggies, a lot of whole grains, unsaturated plant oils, a lot of lot of like proteins that actually come from plants. And if you look at the animal source foods, the dairy and also the animal source proteins, it's a small sliver of this diet. So it's really replacing these animal source foods, the dairy foods that we tend to eat way in really, really large, being able to replace those with the things like the whole grains, with like the plant source proteins, with like healthy oils. And this, when you look at a lot of the food consumption patterns on Earth, this is not how we're eating. We're eating way, way too much dairy foods, and way, if you're looking at red meat consumption, it's too high. So this is what a healthy diet would look like. And you may have some questions about this, and I'd be happy to answer some and break this down a bit more later. Now, is this how everybody on the planet eats, though? Do we all eat in a healthy way? Is it imbalanced? Are there certain parts of the planet that are eating too much of one thing and not that much of the other? Well, one of the characteristics of the current global system is it's characterized by high inequalities. And this is just North America right here in terms of what people are eating. This orange dashed line that you see right there is the health boundary that you see. So we should be eating up of each one of the food groups up to that boundary. If you're going over the boundary, you're eating too much of the food group. If you're under the boundary, you're not eating enough of that food group. So you can see in North America, it's overconsumption of things like red meat, potatoes, eggs, chicken, dairy. 638% more red meat than what we need for the optimal food intake, as I outlined in the previous, on the plate slide. And if you look at the consumption of the healthy foods that I showed, those foods that have low environmental impact that are good for our health as well, it's the nuts, the whole grains, legumes, fruits, veggies. You can see they're not consumed enough. And if you could find nuts and whole grains there, you can hardly even see that wedge. So there's this imbalance in terms of what people are eating. This is just North America. Now let's look at other parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa is a very different story. It's under consumption of almost every single food group, except potatoes. Now, a lot of starchy vegetables, which are filling bellies, but not providing a well-balanced diet. You look at South Asia, underconsumption of nearly everything. So you start to see this picture and you just start to map it out in terms of who's eating what. You see some countries that are eating a lot of certain foods, the high impact foods, and other countries that are not eating enough. And we have this very skewed distribution of food intake that we're going to have to figure out how to solve moving forward. Now, we just published a study last Thursday where we looked at the G20 countries, because what we wanted to unpack was, well, if we're looking at this global distribution of food, then what is the role of the G20? And do we find that they emit more greenhouse gas emissions than other places, and when it comes to the foods that they eat? So what you see here is you see the greenhouse gas emissions from the entire planet. The orange dashed line is a planetary boundary for food. So that is the carbon budget for food. So that is the amount that we have allocated to the planet of the impact that we can have, the emissions that we can emit from like producing food. Because no matter what we do, we're going to have an impact. And we said the Earth can probably tolerate about 5 gigatons. What you see on the very far left is that the G20 is consuming about 75%, 3.7 gigatons of the entire emission budget, dominated by China, India, Brazil, USA, EU, leaving the rest of the world only about 1.9 gigatons. And we're over the climate boundary. So moving forward to 2050, we need to figure out how we get it to under this orange dash planetary boundary that you see right here. And we start to redistribute and say, well, what we really need to move towards is the far right-hand distribution, where you have the G20 consuming a lot less of global emissions, opening up more emissions for the rest of the world, because it's in the other countries outside of the G20 that are still facing significant burdens of undernutrition. And they have to, first of all, tackle that before they start to think about tackling greenhouse gas emissions from food. Now, that's total emissions. If you look at the per capita emissions, it's a very different story. Total emissions, China looks very high, India looks very high. But if you look at per capita, the story is quite different. Here you've got Australia, which has got high per capita emissions. You see the orange dashed line right, that's also the planetary boundary for food. So we should be under that orange dashed line. So Australia, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, way over this line. Almost every single country is, but except India, Japan, Turkey, and a few others. There's only a handful of countries within the actual G20 that are under the planetary boundary for food. And it's a few countries that from a per capita standpoint, that are going to have to make much larger emissions cuts than others. Now, what would happen if we actually all follow G20 consumption patterns, the average consumption patterns across all of these countries? Well, current consumption, the far left, as you see here, we'd be 263% above the planetary boundary for food. If we follow national dietary guidelines, we'd be about 178 above. If we follow the planetary health diet, that plate that I showed you, so if we switch towards more plant-based diets, a lot healthier diets, we'd be right at the planetary boundary for food. So you can definitely see here that current consumption patterns and even following national dietary guidelines will not get us where we need to go. We have to start switching towards more of a plant-based diets. And the countries that have to lead here are the G20 countries. They're the ones that are going to have to step up. Now the footprint, if you want to play it up by planet Earth's, you can start to see that if we follow current consumption patterns in different parts of the world, so if we follow the Argentinian diet, we would need about 7.42 Earths. The Australian diet, 6.83. American diet, 5.55. UK, 3.98. And it's only India and Indonesia that have a dietary pattern, current consumption patterns that are within the footprint of the entire planet. So clearly we have a long way to go. And food is one of those issues that when we're talking about climate change, you asked at the very start of this, does it actually really matter what we eat? It absolutely matters. I mean, food is one of those things that has the largest impact on food or on the actual planet. And we're going to have to start wrestling with that. And the G20 countries, many of the countries that we all live in, are going to have to make the most ambitious cuts out there, the most ambitious dietary changes. Now, the great thing about food, we're probably all signed up to this talk because we care about the planet. We want to make the world a better place. And, I think what I found with individuals is people struggle a lot trying to figure out how I can make a difference. Whether it's, do I fly less? How do I reduce my footprint? The great thing about food is it is probably the single greatest action that you can take if you want to have an impact. And you can do it every single day. And you can start this evening with the food that you choose. It empowers us to make the correct choices. And that is a great thing about food. The power is actually on your plate, and you can do it. And it's not only going to impact your health, you're not only going to feel better from it, but it's going to make the planet a better place. So with that, I will open it up for questions, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry, I'll just let you. That was terrific, thank you. So I have just a quick question first, which is, if I hadn't thought much about sustainability yet, what is the one choice I could make that would have the biggest impact in terms of sustainability if I'm currently following a sort of traditional Western diet of, mainly of meat and a bit of veg? Like what choice is sort of the biggest in terms of sustainable impact?
From a dietary standpoint, you mean?
Yeah.
It's those high impact foods. It's really switching away from animal source foods. They have the highest health and the highest environmental impact, much larger than any others. And it's basically red meat. And in no way am I saying, or, like we aren't saying stop eating red meat. We're not saying that people have to become vegetarian. We're not saying that people have to become vegans, but it's definitely cutting back on the amount of red meat, especially that we're eating, those animal source foods. And, it's interesting because when you think back even 20, 30 years ago, this idea that we have to have meat with every single plate, every single or every single meal is a pretty new phenomenon. It's not something that we used to do. I mean, if you think back to your grandparents and ask them how they used to eat, it probably wasn't meat for every single meal. That's something that is very new. So I think we can actually shift back, and we're going to have to start replacing those animal source foods with more plant source foods, and do it fairly quickly.
Cool, thank you. So I suppose this is following up. Often people who've just begun switching to more plant-based diets end up getting a lot of information about the negative impact of some of the alternatives that are there. So, for example, if you're trying to have more soy milk or almond milk, you hear about rainforests being affected by soy, or methane in paddy fields from rice milk or something. How much are these kind of these mixed messages you get about the alternatives things we should be taking seriously? And are there sort of rules of thumb or heuristics that we can follow to know where to stay clear and where we should be changing our food behavior?
I think no matter where you dig, you're going to find some issue, but at the end of the day, drinking soy milk, it has a much lower impact than having animal source foods. Where we need to start shifting is we can't be producing soy milk at the expense of like tropical rainforest. So we have to be shifting towards more sustainably produced foods. And at some point, we're going to have to start getting that information into the hands of like the consumer so that you can make that choice. But a lot of these things, when you're talking about magnitude of impact, if you want to make a choice today, it's those choices that you make have a much lower impact than eating animal source foods, than eating red meat. So I would say that you can feel rest assured that if you were consuming soy milk and if you were consuming some of those other things, that you're doing something which is good for your health and also which is actually good for the planet. So,
cool. Thank you. Yeah, my next question is about the topic of eating locally. Because I've also heard slightly mixed messages about this in terms of local food being good in supporting local communities and also in cutting down on air miles specifically if you're looking for carbon impact. But also mixed messages that sometimes eating locally means that you have to grow the produce in a way that's actually more carbon intensive. So are there ways, are there again kind of patterns that you can use? Are there ways in which you can know when to eat locally and what's important there?
Yeah, this is one of those, if you're talking about myth busting, this is one of the most important topics out there, I think. And the thing when it comes to food, people get so impassioned about it. You know, it's local food is the best, and it's either or. It's organic food. It's and you know, I think what we need to do moving forward is we need to if anybody is looking for a single solution or some kind of panacea to solve these problems, it's not that simple. And that is one of those issues with local foods, is that, you know, I think in some cases, when possible, local food works. You know, it can actually, it's probably better to grow your food locally and to be able to decrease air miles, shorten supply chains. So that's good. But in many cases, people can't grow their food locally. You know, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Nigeria, you know, many parts of the world. So that doesn't work. And when you start to look at the modeling effects of this, is that if everybody switched towards local food, greenhouse gas emissions would go up dramatically. Biodiversity loss would go up dramatically, because a lot of places would then have to convert their land into farmland to grow their food locally. And that's not probably the best way forward. And really what we're going to have to realize going forward is the only way that we're going to be able to feed every single person on this planet is for all of us to cooperate and to figure out that 40% of the global land that we use for farms, where we should be growing food. Where's the best place to be growing potatoes or fruits or veggies or nuts or legumes or beef? You know, and there are certain parts of the world that are better suited to it than others. You know, it's probably better to grow beef on the Midwestern high prairie grasslands than cutting down tropical rainforest in Brazil. If there's one place that you had to choose, you'd probably want to choose one or the other. You know, and that's what that's the jigsaw puzzle that we're going to have to figure out is how we start to optimize the land that we have. And then we're going to have to trade. We're going to have to trade this food everywhere so that everybody has access to it. And if we decarbonize the energy system, if we decarbonize the overall transport system, then transporting food and the impact that that's going to have won't matter anyway, because it will be a carbon neutral impact. And even today, if you look at the transportation of food, the impact of it is actually quite small. It's much smaller than you'd think. So at the end of the day, local food is great in some circumstances, but it's not going to solve the issue by itself.
Cool, thank you. I was going to ask about as well issues of the way in which sustainable food is communicated, because I think a lot of the time people associate it with eating food on a much higher budget, so having to buy meat alternatives and also just not being able to get protein in an affordable way unless you buy cheap meat. So I was wondering, firstly, what do you think of these issues in terms of like, can you eat sustainably on a low budget? And secondly, are there ways in which we can sort of communicate it in ways that don't make it feel like it's a thing for people who are extremely wealthy?
Yes, but affordability is a huge issue that we're going to have to tackle. You know, and if there are circumstances where healthy foods cost more than unhealthy foods, that's a big problem. And there are many cases where there are circumstances where healthy foods cost more. You know, and when we can walk into a supermarket and it costs more to buy a bag of fruit than it does to buy like a bag of potato chips, that's a bit of a problem. And we're going to have to start true costing the overall impact of foods. And that's one of the things that we're not actually doing at this point. And I guarantee that if you were to walk into a supermarket and the situation was actually a bit different, where you looked at a bag of fruit and it was 50 cents, and you looked at the bag of chips and it was $10 or the meat, or, you know, I think from an economic standpoint, you would make very different decisions. So affordability is something that we're going to have to address, but that doesn't mean that healthy food is always more expensive. There's been some studies that have been done that have said that healthy eating is actually less expensive than eating in a more traditional way, because in many cases, red meat costs a lot of money. And if you take that out of your diet, then you're actually saving quite a bit. But that is really context dependent, depending upon the cost of foods in that area. But communicating this, if we do come across of, that you've got to be driving a Tesla to a farmer's market to be buying healthy food, and that's the only way that we can have access to that is an issue, and we're going to have to change that, and we're going to have to make healthy eating as sexy and as accessible as eating other foods. And I think, if you look at McDonald's, and if you look at the other companies that promote their foods, the unhealthy foods, they do a great job of marketing. And I think in some cases, the healthier eating industries, we haven't quite figured it out yet. We're going to have to wrap our heads around how to make these foods much more interesting to people.
Great, thank you. So I've got a few questions from the audience now, which I'll take. So the first one is to do with how COVID has changed the issues. So the question is, messaging permanent changes to food choices must be prominent and backed by experts, and COVID has shown the need for behavioral change. So how do we, I guess the question is, how do we get behavioral change, like changing food habits, to be permanent in a way that,
Okay, well, let me talk about COVID first. And I think COVID has definitely raised the issue of food to a level of prominence that it hasn't been before. So that's good. People are talking about systems, they're talking about shorter supply chains, they're talking about access, they're talking about meat, where this is coming from. So that's good. So I think food is being talked about. What I find to be a bit frustrating about the COVID conversation is we're not talking about some of the systemic challenges, and we're not talking about systemic changes. For example, we're not talking about the fact that people that are less healthy have higher risk rates of dying from COVID-19, whether they're suffering from type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular diseases. Unhealthy individuals in some parts of the world are dying at faster rates. And if we can treat some of those underlying causes, and if people were healthy, we might be able to tackle this a bit better. We might have immune systems that were better equipped to be able to fight this. I think we're also going to have to look at the systemic challenges and treat some of the underlying symptoms as well, not just put Band-Aid solutions on it. So it's great that COVID-19 has raised the issue, but we have a lot more work to actually do with this. The second part of the question was about
I think just generally.
Yes. Anyway, behavioral change. I would say I'm not a huge believer of behavioral change, because I think it takes too long. I'm not saying that we shouldn't impact people's behavior, because we absolutely should, and I think we can do it and we should do it, but we shouldn't rely on behavioral change by itself. And I think if we had 100 to 200 years to solve this problem, then behavioral change might be the way to go. That's if we could change people's perceptions and get education campaigns and get kids to rethink the way that they think about food, then that's probably the most sustainable way to do it. But when we're talking about tackling climate change between now and 2050, what are the fast levers that we have to pull, and doing more regulatory, more economic levers? Like I said, if you make healthy food less expensive and unhealthy food more expensive, that might change behavior by itself, instead of relying on behavioral change and people to make those decisions by themselves. So we need both, but we can't rely on behavioral change by itself.
Great. Okay. Have there, sorry, this is just a question. I was wondering, have there been that many sort of government policy initiatives that are that have been successful in changing people's food habits, or in similar areas?
No, I know of very few. I mean, there are some sugar taxes that have helped, but once again, that's an economic incentive. That's not a behavioral change. I mean, it forces behavioral change because things actually cost more money. But in terms of other policies, I think that there's very little evidence that behavioral change by itself has a huge impact. You know, and once again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that let's not rely upon that by itself.
Okay, thank you. So my next question from the audience is that there seem to be mixed messages around organic food. Apparently they're the better option, but is it problematic on the global scale if it means less efficient land usage, which is an important issue?
Yeah, this is a bit like the local food issue. You know, people could become very passionate about organic food. You know, you either support it or you don't. And if you don't support organic food, then you're somehow not an environmentalist. You don't care for the planet. And I think we have to be extremely cautious once again of looking at a single solution in one of these panaceas, because organic food by itself, in certain circumstances, is great. If it decreases the amount of pesticide use, if it's, you know, there are advantages to it. But there has been some research that has shown that to do it at a global scale is going to be very hard. So moving forward, I think we need to adopt lots of different types of farming practices, and organic food is part of the suite of solutions, is part of the overall suite of things that we should do. But once again, we should not rely upon that by itself.
Okay, great. And I think this is a question from the audience, but I'm going to combine it with one of my own questions. So someone in the audience is asking about how plant-based foods are often much less resource intensive than animal ones, yet often more expensive. Why is this? Is it due to the economics of scale or subsidies to traditional animal agriculture? And I was also wondering whether you could touch on kind of the future of plant-based alternatives. In terms of, do you think in the long run we will just get laboratory grown meat, or do you think we will end up switching to a much more just plant-based in general diet?
I would say there's a number of factors. Subsidies towards certain industries is a huge issue, and I think that if we subsidize more of the plant-based foods, we'd find out very quickly that those foods cost a lot less. You know, we're not putting the true cost of unhealthy foods. We're not actually building that into the foods themselves. And if we started to do that, and it's also, there's not enough people producing it. There's not the economic incentive, and there hasn't been at this point to actually, you know, to actually produce it at scale. And I think that works against the affordability of these foods. But it's all issues that we can address. But it's going to have to come through smart policy. It's going to have to come through government regulation, combined with individuals pushing and putting people in power that will actually make these changes. Yeah, so I would say that, yeah, it's probably a combination of all of them.
And just your thoughts on, it's quite a trendy topic, the idea that we could just be growing lab meat very soon. And then,
yeah. Sorry, yeah, of course. I hope not. I mean, I hope that in the future we're not only growing lab meat. I think there are some great plant-based alternatives out there that probably have lower environmental impacts, and I think we're at the early stages of this. But in a lot of cases, these foods are not more healthy. They might have a lower environmental impact, but the health impact is as high as actually eating meat. So you might be solving the environmental problem and replacing it with a health problem. So if I could predict in the future, I would say that these lab-based alternatives, whether it's plant alternatives or whatever it is, will probably always function at the edges. They'll supply food at the margins, but I'm skeptical that they will ever be able to be scaled to the level where we could feed most of the people on this planet only on those foods. It's a bit like eating insects, and there are a lot of wonderful opportunities out there, and if we put all these opportunities together, it'll help. But I think there's always going to be a place for grass-fed beef.
Okay. I think this is another somewhat like myth-busting style question. Well, I guess we'll find out if it's a myth or not. That people often argue that much of the land used for livestock is not actually suitable for crops. Is this, how true is this? And does this also mean that as we change our diets to become more plant-based, this will, I guess, cause greater pressure on the food system? And the question is also asked whether it would lead to increased habitat loss if we need to grow more crops in other areas.
Great question, because the land use issue going forward is one of those extremely tricky issues that we're going to have to figure out how do we start to collaborate on this. It is actually true that a lot of the land that is used for animal agriculture, rangeland and pasture land, is not suitable for crops. And a lot of the land that is used for animal agriculture is grasslands, it's rangelands, it's ecosystems that store carbon, it's ecosystems that have a lot of biodiversity on them. So in a lot of cases, keeping cows on these areas is probably the best alternative that we have. Now, moving forward from a global cropland standpoint, any land that we free up that is currently used for animal ag, whether it's soy that we feed to cattle or anything that land that would be freed up by switching towards more plant-based diets will be automatically replaced by growing more plants. And what it looks like going forward, by feeding about 10 billion people by 2050, the amount of cropland that we have today, if we all shifted towards plant-based diets, we won't be able to reduce any of that. We can probably do it on the same amount of land that we have, and that's just like cropland.
Wow.
When we look at pasture lands and rangelands, then that land can still stay reserved for animal agriculture, but we're also going to have to figure out how we can free up some of that land so that we can convert it back to forest. Because to fight climate change, we're going to have to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And some of the best and only lands that we have out there to do that are some of these rangelands. So it's not simple, and I think moving forward we're going to have some sort of global cooperation of all these lands, where things are grown, who's actually growing what, and but simply shifting towards plant-based diets won't free up tons of land.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry. And I was wondering as well, what are the main issues around sort of biodiversity and food? How do they overlap with those to do with cutting carbon footprint in food? So do they ever clash, or are they generally the same issues in terms of like the individual choices we're making for food?
Generally the same issues, but where it does clash with, there are things like local land use, so if we were to advocate, and if you think about some of the arguments around COVID-19, people are saying we should go towards more local food systems, and coming back to the local argument, this is where, for example, biodiversity clashes, where if we did shift towards more local foods, then biodiversity loss would actually go up. You think about a place like Madagascar. If we said, well, within Madagascar, we're going to try and tackle and grow our food locally. We're going to increase consumption of healthy foods. That would probably lead towards increased land use, increased pressure on the land, which means we'd probably cut down more trees, which would increase biodiversity loss. So from the environmental perspective, they are very closely aligned. But less aligned with some of the other issues that we tend to hold on to very, very dearly.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me just check if we've got any more. Yeah, so I've got one more question from the audience, and then we finish up, which is, what is the best way to let people know how to change their diet? Is it through government initiatives, through education? And I guess that's also linked to, you were saying that in some ways you don't think behavioral change is actually the biggest way of doing this. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
We need all of them, which is a really poor answer. But we absolutely need education. We absolutely need government regulation. We need reform national dietary guidelines. We need this message everywhere, but we also need marketing. I think one of the things that people respond to more than anything else is like marketing. And if we're continuing to market unhealthy foods to young people, that's what they're going to actually choose. And I said it before that we need to make healthy food a lot more sexy, a lot more interesting. And I guarantee that if we were able to change a perception of healthy foods to being delicious and good, and this is what the cool people eat, this is what sports people eat, this is you can be healthy and strong this way. I think that perception could change very quickly. And the thing with diets is we tend to think it's one of those like intractable problems that it's impossible to shift diets. But if you look at certain countries, their diets have shifted extremely quickly from more the traditional diet that they held on to for many, many years towards more of a Western diet. And that has mainly been driven by marketing. And I firmly believe that we can shift that back. But it's going to take the help of private sector. It's going to take the help from us to push for it, and also the government to start to demand that this is the messaging that we're going to make sure that all of our citizens see.
Okay, great. Sorry, I have one last question that I'd like to know the answer to as well that's on here. So someone said, you've stressed the need for international solutions. Is this something that can be provided through the international free market we currently have, or will it need more radical change on a global scale?
International free market is huge. So we're going to have to get everybody on board with this. We're going to have to get businesses on board with this, but we're going to have to get private citizens on board. But we're also going to have almost like a Paris type agreement for the food system. I think that if we had some sort of framework convention on food where individual countries could see where their individual piece of the puzzle sat within this global framework, and we all signed up for it and we all committed to the fact that we are going to change this, we can make some huge progress on this. In 2021, the UN is hosting a summit, food system summit, the first time that they're going to do this. And there have been some ideas floated about this framework convention for food. And if we could get a government body and a scientific panel like an IPCC for food, I think this would help. But we can't rely on the UN to solve the problems. It's a very slow process. And this is where the free market, this is where businesses can actually step in, because they can make changes very, very quickly.
Cool, great. Thank you so much for this. I think that's probably just about all we've got time for. But
that's great. Thank you very much. I mean, this is a great topic, and it's it's exciting that you guys are wrestling with these issues, and especially the fact that you want to break some of the myths, because there are so many myths out there. So excellent. Good job.
Cool. Thank you. So in light of that, we're going to actually move over to a cooking workshop now. We've got Jaya with us now, who is, sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm just going to introduce her now. Sorry, who's from...
Thanks, I'm going to sign off. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, Brent. Bye. Thanks so much. Who is lead head chef at Delish Vegan in Oxford. She had such a popular food stall that she opened a restaurant a few years ago. And we're going to learn how to make a very versatile dish, which means that you can use it with whatever you have in the fridge, which will cut down on waste, but also a vegan sauce that you can use with pretty much any vegetables that you have. So on that, I will just pass over to Jaya. Can you unmute your iPhone?
Done.
Oh, great. Thank you. Awesome.
Is that well set?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah, I'm ready with the onions. They're already fried. Not too much cooking, but cook through. And then to this, I hope that people did ready cook them, but if you didn't, it doesn't matter. If you're at the level where your onions are already cooked, like this, or even a little bit less cooked, then you're ready to add the spices. So here are the spices. I've got fenugreek, chili, I've got fresh chili and chili powder. You don't need to add both, but this is quite good if you have it in the cupboard. If you don't have fresh chilies, you can use this, or a combination, depending on what your taste is. Turmeric, cumin seeds, ground coriander, salt, black pepper, and I said fenugreek cold. So I'm not going to put the fresh chili, I'm going to put the chili powder. So I'm going to add it to the onions. Let's give it a little mix, just a little bit. It doesn't need to be actually cooked, but just need to go through it. Can you hear me clearly, Ellie?
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, good. And then to this, I've got a can of tomatoes, as I said, and I've cut them with the scissors, just so they're nicely chopped. So you can just chop them with a knife if you don't have a scissors, or if you wanted to get your hands in, you could just wash them with your fingers so that it's nice and shredded, or you could buy the chopped tomatoes, but even then they do need to be a bit more mushy. Add that, and then give it a mix. You could also use tomato passata. I'm sorry?
Sorry, I think, yes, sorry, we can hear you again now, thanks.
Okay. You could also add tomato passata if you wanted to. Instead of the tomatoes, you could add passata. So we're going to just let this cook through. And while it's cooking, I'm going to show you what you can use the sauce for. So today I prepared green beans and peas. You could add, because green beans are quite good, healthy, and very readily available. You could have a pack in the freezer that you could use. Peas are really good for health if you're a vegan. It's one of the essential foods that you should have as a vegan. I've got mung beans that I've actually grown, and they're so easy to grow. You just wet them in water overnight, leave them at the side covered without water, wash them daily, and in about 3 days you get a lovely growth like this. So you could use it with mung beans. You could use this sauce with an aubergine chopped up nicely. You could use it with a broccoli cut up nicely into small pieces. If you didn't want to use tomato can or the passata, you could use fresh tomatoes finely chopped and put them in at the same stage as I did. We're going to let this sizzle for some time. To this, I've got ginger, fresh ginger, that grated, garlic grated, and I'm going to add that to the mix. I'm not sure, Ellie, did you get some coconut cream?
I did, yeah, but my sister's actually making it downstairs, so I'm not.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get coconut cream. I don't have any coconut cream. So I wanted to show that if you don't have coconut cream, especially at the moment, really easy to have is coconut, which is, it's a cream coconut, which is a solid block, which is available, and it lasts for ages in the fridge, and it has no bad ingredients in it. It's just coconut condensed. It's a bit like ghee, but it's coconut ghee. And I've cut it, shredded it a little bit. So it's like maybe 1.5 tablespoons full. So I'm going to put that in just to show you that it doesn't have to be that you need coconut cream. If you have coconut cream, great, but it's not available. I tried to get some, but because of COVID, I couldn't get any, I'm afraid. To this, I'm also going to add 2 teaspoons full. There's 2 teaspoons full in here of desiccated coconut. Another ingredient that you could have in the cupboard. It doesn't go off and it can last for ages, which means that it's readily available when you want it, without it being, going off. And if you're a single person like myself, it's much easier to have dry ingredients that are ready and that you could use a little bit of, rather than having a can that you open and for one person it's too much. So as you can see, the sauce is lovely and it's sizzling now. Now to this, I also add, I'm going to make the gas, it's on medium at the moment, cook it normally on medium, but I'm going to make it a little bit higher so it cooks a little bit quicker. So that's that really, and we're just going to cook it for a little while and then see what happens to the sauce. Any questions, Kelly?
Yeah, so I was wondering, what are the typical, you mentioned a few of the typical things that you could have with it. Do you normally prepare those in advance, or would you be making those at the same time? Like, what's the
No. So when the sauce is ready, what I will do is, this is why I prepared these green beans and peas. I thought in a separate pot, I will show you what to do. So you can have the sauce that's ready. Once it's ready, you can put it to the side and you can keep it in the fridge if you want to. When you're ready to make it, you just take some of this sauce and put it with the ingredients that you have.
Cool, thanks. And how long does the sauce itself last? Can you make it a while in advance?
Yes, you could make my daughter, she makes it in advance, like she did a big cook-off on a Sunday and it lasts the whole week. So if you make a large amount of it, you can keep it in containers.
Cool. And someone's just asked if you could remind again what the spices are in the sauce.
I'm sorry, say that again.
What were the spices again that you put in the sauce? You had the tray of different spices there.
Yes, so we use turmeric, coriander, chili powder. But if you don't want to use chili powder, you could use fresh chilies. But at the moment, they're not always available. So dry powder is just as good. But the reason why I cooked the powder, did you see I put it in the onions first and let it heat through? It's sometimes in these powders, if there's any kind of germs or anything, because you know you're never sure about, I'm never sure about the ingredients that come in a packet. So if you cook it through first, it's going to be high heated, so it's not going to affect your stomach. So you cook it through, put the spices in, and then put the tomatoes in. So and then fenugreek. I put a little bit of fenugreek. It's the same ingredients that's on the list. I've got some powder of. You can either use cayenne pepper or paprika, and that's only for color. If you don't have it, it's not really a big deal. It's not going to change the taste. It will just change the color. Especially useful if you're using fresh tomatoes, because fresh tomatoes, you don't always get the lovely red color.
And you mentioned to me last time as well that if you the tiki masala sauces that you get in restaurants, often they take all of that and blend it and then add it to, is that right? Then add it to
yes.
chicken or veg or whatever you are eating at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
So once this sauce is made, and you will see it's already starting to separate, it starts separating from the edges because the oil is sizzling with the onion and the sauce is nearly cooked. You know it's cooked when it's like, it forms kind of a mixture. Like before, when you put your spoon through, it was kind of, your spoon was going through without taking the sauce with you. But now it's kind of bunching together and the pot's almost clean. You see the pot's almost clean.
Yeah.
So you know the sauce is cooked. But you can cook it a little bit more, but it's cooked now.
Great.
Okay, so I'm just going to get another pot to show you how to do it, okay? So I'm going to put this one aside over here. I'm going to put this one on here.
Are there any other tips as well that you would recommend? You mentioned to me that one thing you always do is have everything that you're about to cook with out on the counters before you even start.
Yes. What I do is all the ingredients I need, all the measurements and everything, I put it in a big plate or a plate where it's all together in one place, because you are going to put it all together in the pot at one time anyway. So if you prepare everything in advance, prepare your vegetables in advance. So when you're making the sauce, once the onions are done, you can just tip everything into the pot. Because what happens often when I'm teaching people to cook, when the onions are done, then they basically do this. Onions are ready, and then they start doing this, and then they start doing this. And by that time, this first spice that you put in is already burnt. So you don't want to do that. You want to have it all ready in advance. And especially if you're in a rush, or I think it's a great way to get into practice of getting everything ready before you start cooking, because then once you start, you know you've got everything there and you can lay your hands on whatever you want and it's in the pot, rather than thinking, oh, what did I forget? Did I forget something? Because often my mind's a million miles away and I forget something. Right. And then when it doesn't taste right, I think, oh, something's missing. Then I remember, oh, I didn't put this. So I always get my spices ready, but I also find it really handy that my spices are in here. So I know that in most of my cooking, I'm going to use these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of them most of the time. This one I don't use that much often. This one I don't use that often. I only use it for certain things. Okay, so you see the sauce really cooked now?
Yeah.
What I do is when I have little pots like this, say throwing them away, I keep them and then I put the sauce inside there. And if I fill it like half of it, that's enough for one portion. So I make the sauce, cool it down, put it in here, put it in the fridge or the freezer. So I know it's one portion in here. So I tend to keep a lot of these little containers that I can use later.
What are the most common vegetarian and vegan additions to this sauce that you'd have? So if you're trying to avoid meat,
you could literally add anything to it. You could even add pasta to it. You could put this. I'm going to show you. I'm going to put this pan here, and I'm going to put a little bit of this sauce.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I need. So for this, I'm going to heat the sauce because the pan's not hot enough yet. Let it get hot enough. Okay, this is all you need to do. You don't need to add any more oil because it's already oily enough. You had coconut oil in there, coconut fat in there, and also a little bit of cooking oil to cook the onions. So it's enough oil, you don't need to add any more. So once the sauce is sizzling, I'm going to add the vegetables that I prepared in.
Lovely.
So you could add any vegetable that you're going to use, you can add it in the same way and then cook it through. That's it. You could add pasta to this as well. You know, the long pasta, or you could add small pasta, cut it up, put it in there. If you're going to cook the pasta, which takes a long time to cook, maybe you could cook them a little bit in first, like cook them al dente and then put them in there in the sauce. But this sauce, instead of having a separate sauce for pasta, you could use this sauce as pasta sauce. You could add mushrooms to it, anything you want basically. And you see, Ellie, the sauce is already going through to the spices. So you could add a little bit of water just to allow the vegetables to cook.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit closer to the microphone? Sorry about that. I think it's just a bit harder to hear you.
Sorry. A little bit of water. Because it's sizzling, I can't hear you.
And then you'd serve this with rice.
You could serve it with rice, you could serve it with roti. If you're having it with pasta, you could just have it with pasta. If you're avoiding wheat, you could just have it on its own. I mean, it's a sustainable meal on its own. But it's nice with roti. I always eat it with roti or rice. You could have it with couscous if you wanted to. If you let it get cold, you could have it, if you make it, cook it until it's quite dense, it will go nice and dry when it's cold. You could have it in a sandwich. You could actually literally put it in a sandwich and eat it.
Wow.
So you see, that's why I said cook the aubergines, cut the aubergines small so that it cooks quicker.
Yep.
You see, it's done. You could literally serve this like that. If you like it more cooking, you could cook it some more. You could put, I have done this as well. I've put this mixture in a plate like this, topped it with a little bit of cheese, vegan cheese. I put slices of potatoes and then more cheese on top and then baked it in the oven, like a bake.
Yeah, yeah. So it can be quite a fusion dish as well, because it's got those, yeah, I see.
So the sauce can be, and especially, being vegan, it's really difficult. Okay, so that's really sizzling now. So it's really literally cooked, it's ready.
Were those beans pre-cooked, by the way, or were they fresh?
No, they're fresh. So I don't like to cook them too much. But if you like it really cooked, then you can cook it for a bit longer. But for me, I don't like to cook it too much so as they're really overcooked. But you don't need to pre-cook them. You can just cook them in here, add a little bit extra water and cover it so it cooks. So if you like it really cooked, then that's the way to do.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The other thing you could do is you can have a pot like this. I got this pot ready. You could have a pot like this. If you make a note and you could add it to your side, is that if you have 1.5 cup of water, so 1.5 cup of water in the pot, boil it, boil the water, add 1 cup of rice to it, and then add 2 or 3 tablespoons of this sauce in there. mix it together, and you have like a khichdi rice
Wow.
from one source.
Yes, I see. So it's extremely versatile in terms of not only that you can make it from anything once you've got sort of the tomato and spices as a base, but also you can add it to almost anything.
Yes, and also like if you like, I'm vegan, but if I had a partner, he may not be a vegan. So sometimes you have to make two lots of dishes to think, what shall I make? What shall I make? And if you do cook meat for your partner, or if you want to for a special dinner date or something, you could use the sauce. You could put half some with your food, so you can make it vegetable vegan for yourself. But for him, you could add a little bit of chicken or something, so he's happy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a thing, because I mean, we're not all lucky enough to have a partner that is vegan also, but so I mean, my son went vegan, which is really lucky for me, otherwise he wasn't a vegan, and that was a difficulty, because in one house there's two people and you have to cook so many things just to satisfy, so
yeah, I guess, or you can just make such delicious vegan food that they get.
Yes. Yeah. Well, cool. Yeah, he is now vegan, and his girlfriend, who also lives with us, she's also nearly a vegan. She hardly ever eats meat except when she goes home, and she's enjoying all the food that I make.
I see. Cool. Well, great. Thank you so much for showing us that, Jaya. I should also mention that Jaya is going to be running some vegan cooking workshops in Oxford in person. So if you're in Oxford, keep an eye out, or go to your website, which is delishvegan.com. Is that right?
It's delish.com.
Delish.com. Okay. And yeah, and they're also selling gift vouchers, and yeah.
But just try the recipe, and you could change as you like it. But persevere. First time it's never going to be good. Maybe a couple of 3 times and it'll be perfection, something that you can fall back on. And being vegan is so easy, because we don't have to go to the supermarket to buy stuff. We have so many things like dal, lentil. You could add lentils to this as well. Like you could put kind of chickpeas in there, or you could put red kidney beans in there, which I often do. And it's so easy. It's so easy to do. You could just make a meal within moments. In less time it takes for you to go to the supermarket to buy a ready-made packet of vegan food, put it in the oven and wait for it to cook. You could make this food really easily for yourself, fresh.
Great. That's great. Thank you so much, Jaya.
Thank you. No, thank you.
I'm going to say goodbye and end the live stream now. But thanks everyone for watching this.
Bye. Enjoy cooking.
Thank you. And I'm sure, I learned a lot about sustainable food. And this event will also be kept up on YouTube afterwards, so you can refer back to it later.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Bye.